What if a simple trip to the store on a sweltering Georgia afternoon turned a retired Black Army general into the target of a deputy's rage, and the hero Hazelton never knew it needed? What if a simple trip to the store on a sweltering Georgia afternoon turned a retired Black Army general into the target of a deputy's rage, and the hero Hazelton never knew it needed? The year was 1963, and the late summer sun cast a golden glow over Hazelton, a small riverside town nestled along the banks of the Ocmulgee River in southern Georgia. The town was a sleepy patchwork of brick storefronts, whitewashed porches, and sprawling pecan orchards, where the air carried the earthy scent of river mud and the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias. At the heart of Hazelton stood the Hazelton General Store, a weathered building with a tin awning and a faded Coca-Cola sign swinging lazily in the breeze. Inside the store was a cozy haven of wooden shelves stocked with jars of pickled okra, sacks of cornmeal, and bolts of calico fabric, the hum of a ceiling fan mixing with the chatter of locals catching up on gossip. Major General Clara Jackson, a 55-year-old Black woman with a commanding presence softened by years of quiet resilience, stepped through the store's screen door, the hinges creaking softly behind her. She wore a simple yellow sundress with a cardigan, her sensible loafers tapping against the scuffed pine floor, and her graying hair pulled into a neat bun beneath a straw hat. Clara had retired to Hazelton 2 years ago after a decorated career in the U.S. Army, where she led troops through the tail end of World War II and into the Korean War, earning medals for bravery that now sat in a box under her bed. She'd moved here for the peace of small-town life, hoping to spend her days tending her vegetable garden and baking cornbread for the church potlucks. Today, she'd come to the store to pick up a few things for supper: some flour, a jar of molasses, and a bunch of collard greens. Clara moved through the aisles with a calm purpose, nodding politely to the handful of customers inside. Mrs. Harper, a school teacher in a polka dot dress, picking out a tin of baking powder. Old Mr. Dawson, a farmer with a straw hat, examining a sack of potatoes, and a teenage girl named Jenny, giggling over a rack of penny candy with her friend. The store's owner, Miss Betty, stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour as she counted change for a customer. Clara placed her items in a wicker basket, humming an old gospel tune under her breath, savoring the simplicity of the moment. It was the kind of afternoon she dreamed of when she left the Army, a quiet, ordinary day in a town that felt like it could be home. But as Clara reached for a jar of molasses on the shelf, she had no idea that this peaceful afternoon was about to turn into a battle she'd never expected to fight, not on a battlefield, but right here in the aisles of the Hazelton General Store. The Hazelton General Store buzzed with the quiet rhythm of a late summer afternoon, the ceiling fan creaking overhead as Clara Jackson placed her jar of molasses into her wicker basket. She was just about to head toward the counter when a sharp clatter broke the stillness, drawing her attention to the far end of the dry goods aisle. There, Deputy Robert Bobby Hayes stood in his neatly pressed uniform, a silver badge gleaming on his chest. Bobby was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a slicked back mop of dark hair and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He'd been reaching for a can of peaches when his elbow knocked a sack of dried beans and a glass bottle of sarsaparilla off the shelf. The bottle shattered on the pine floor with a loud crack, the dark liquid fizzing across the boards, while the sack of beans burst open, scattering its contents like tiny marbles at his feet. Bobby glanced down at the mess, his smirk fading for a split second before he shrugged, muttered something under his breath, and turned to walk away, his boots thudding against the floor. He didn't even look back as the sarsaparilla pulled around a nearby crate of apples, leaving a sticky trail in its wake. Miss Betty, busy at the counter, hadn't noticed, and the other customers, Mrs. Harper and Mr. Dawson, were too far off to see the incident. But Clara saw it all. Her years in the Army had ingrained a deep sense of discipline and accountability in her, values she'd held her soldiers to, and ones she lived by every day. She couldn't let this slide, not when a man in uniform was setting such a poor example. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd once commanded battalions. "Excuse me, Deputy," she said, her tone polite but unwavering. "You dropped a few things back there. It'd be a kindness to pick them up. Wouldn't want anyone to slip or Have extra work on your account." Bobby stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening as he turned slowly to face her. His blue eyes narrowed, raking over Clara as if she were an inconvenience he hadn't expected to deal with. A slow, disdainful smirk curled his lips, and he crossed his arms, his badge catching the light. "Who do you think you're talking to, lady?" he drawled, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't have time for your nonsense. Why don't you go on and mind your own business?" Clara stood her ground, her basket resting against her hip, her posture as steady as an oak tree rooted deep in Georgia soil. She'd faced down worse than Bobby Hayes in her time. Enemy fire, hostile commanding officers, men who'd sneered at her for the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman leading troops. She wasn't about to let his attitude shake her. "As a deputy, you're meant to set an example for this town," she said, her voice still calm but now edged with a quiet steel. "Picking up after yourself isn't just about courtesy. It's about showing respect for the folks around you and for the uniform you're wearing." The air in the store grew heavy, the hum of the ceiling fans suddenly louder in the silence that followed. Mrs. Harper paused, her hand hovering over a tin of baking powder, her eyes darting toward the confrontation. Mr. Dawson looked up from his sack of potatoes, his weathered face creasing with curiosity. Even Jenny and her friends stopped giggling, their whispers fading as they turned to watch. Clara could feel their gazes, but she kept her focus on Bobby, her hazel eyes locked onto his, unyielding. Bobby's smirk widened into a sneer, his voice taking on a mocking tone as he stepped closer, his boots crunching on the scattered beans. "Respect?" he scoffed, his laugh sharp and grating. "You think I need a lecture on respect from someone like you? I don't take orders from your kind, lady. Why don't you go back to wherever you came from and leave me to do my job?" Clara's chest tightened, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she'd expected. She'd heard that tone before, the casual racism, the assumption that she didn't belong, that her voice didn't matter. But she'd spent her life proving people like Bobby wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. She took a slow breath, her military training keeping her emotions in check, and prepared to respond, knowing this moment was about to change everything. The Hazelton General Store had gone deathly quiet, the weight of Deputy Bobby Hayes' words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Major General Clara Jackson stood firm in the dry goods aisle, her wicker basket still resting against her hip, her hazel eyes locked onto Bobby's with a steely resolve that hadn't wavered in decades. His sneering comment, "I don't take orders from your kind, lady," echoed in her mind, a bitter reminder of the prejudice she'd fought her whole career. But Clara had faced worse on the battlefield. She'd stared down enemy fire and hostile officers who couldn't stomach a black woman giving them orders. A small-town deputy with a chip on his shoulder wasn't going to break her now. Bobby laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that sliced through the silence of the store. He took another step closer, his boots grinding the scattered beans into the pine floor, his broad frame looming over Clara. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he spat, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just another colored woman who doesn't know her place. I'm the law around here, and I don't need you telling me how to do my job." The words hit Clara like a slap, but she didn't flinch. Her shoulders remained squared, her posture unyielding, as if she were facing an enemy on the front lines, rather than a man in a deputy's uniform. She could feel the eyes of the other customers boring into her. Mrs. Harper clutching her tin of baking powder, her mouth slightly agape. Mr. Dawson gripping his sack of potatoes, his weathered face tight with unease. Jenny and her friend whispering nervously by the candy rack. Even Miss Betty had stopped counting change at the counter, her hands frozen as she watched the scene unfold. Clara's voice when she spoke was low and deliberate, cutting through Bobby's bluster like a blade. "I don't need you to think I'm special," she said, her tone as steady as a drumbeat. "But I'll tell you this, deputy. Anyone in this town deserves respect, no matter who they are, and if you can't give that, you don't deserve the badge you're wearing." Bobby's face twisted with rage, his cheeks flushing red as Clara's words struck a nerve. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already dismissed in his mind. His hand twitched toward the holster at his hip, And before anyone could react, he yanked his revolver free, the metal gleaming under the store's dim lights. He pointed it straight at Clara, the barrel steady despite the slight tremble in his fingers. "You better watch your mouth, lady," he growled, his voice thick with venom. "I'm the law, and I'll show you exactly where you belong." A collective gasp rippled through the store. Mrs. Harper let out a small cry, dropping her tin of baking powder with a dull thud. Mr. Dawson stumbled back, his sack of potatoes slipping from his hands and spilling across the floor. Jenny clutched her friend's arm, her eyes wide with fear, while Miss Betty grabbed the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. A few customers fumbled for their cameras, bulky Polaroids that were the pride of 1960s Hazelton, snapping shaky pictures of the standoff, the click of shutters punctuating the tense silence. Clara didn't move. She stood there, her gaze locked on Bobby's, her expression as calm as a still river on a summer morning. She'd faced death too many times to count. Artillery fire in Korea, ambushes in the Pacific. A prejudiced deputy with a gun wasn't going to scare her. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but laced with an unshakable conviction that made the air around her feel heavier. "You're making a big mistake, deputy," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "And it's not just me you'll have to answer to." Bobby's eyes darted to the crowd, his confidence faltering for a split second as he registered their stares. Some fearful, some angry, all judging. The weight of their attention pressed down on him, but instead of lowering his gun, he doubled down, his voice rising with a desperate edge. "You think I care what these folks think?" he snarled, jabbing the gun toward her for emphasis. "I'm in charge here, and you're nothing. You keep running your mouth, and I'll make sure you regret it." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but her face betrayed none of her fear. She'd been trained to stay calm in the face of chaos, and she wasn't about to let Bobby Hayes see her crack. The crowd held its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. Clara knew this moment was no longer just about a spilled bottle or a sack of beans. It was about the values she'd spent her life defending, and she wasn't backing down. Chapter 4. Clara Takes a Stand. The air in the Hazelton General Store was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional click of a Polaroid camera as the crowd captured the standoff. Deputy Bobby Hayes stood in the dry goods aisle, his revolver pointed at Major General Clara Jackson, his hand trembling slightly despite the snarl on his face. "You keep running your mouth and I'll make sure you regret it," he barked, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and desperation. The crowd, Mrs. Harper, Mr. Dawson, Jenny, and the others, watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Bobby's gun and Clara's unyielding stance. Clara stood as still as a statue, her yellow sundress a stark contrast to the chaos around her, her hazel eyes locked onto Bobby's with a calm intensity that unnerved him. She'd faced down worse threats than this in her years of service. Enemy snipers, artillery barrages, men who'd tried to break her spirit with their words and their fists. Bobby Hayes wasn't going to be the one to make her flinch. Her mind raced, but her training kept her steady, her voice as cool and measured as if she were addressing her troops on a battlefield. "You can threaten me all you want, deputy," she said, her words slow and deliberate, "but your actions right now are being seen by everyone here. You're digging your own grave." Bobby's grip on the revolver tightened, his knuckles whitening, but Clara's unshakable calm was starting to get under his skin. He'd expected her to cower, to back down like so many others had when he'd flashed his badge or his gun. But Clara wasn't like anyone he'd ever met, and that unnerved him more than he'd ever admit. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" he snapped, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "You think you can scare me with your big talk? You're nothing." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted her wicker basket to her other arm and reached into the pocket of her cardigan with a slow, deliberate motion, her eyes never leaving Bobby's. The crowd watched, holding their breath, as she pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a stub of a pencil. She flipped the notebook open, her movements precise, and began to write, her handwriting steady despite the gun pointed at her chest. "I'm documenting this," she said, her voice calm but firm, each word carrying the weight of a command. "Every word you've said, every action you've taken. You think you're above the law, deputy? We'll see about that. Bobby's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face as he watched her write. What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his voice cracking with uncertainty. He took a step closer, the gun still raised, but his bravado was starting to crumble under the weight of Clara's composure. Clara didn't look up from her notebook, her pencil moving steadily across the page. I'm making sure there's a record of this, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. You've insulted me, threatened me with a weapon, and abused your power in front of all these witnesses. I'm not letting this slide. She finished writing, tucked the notebook back into her pocket, and then reached into her cardigan again, pulling out a small military-grade handheld radio. A relic from her army days, its black casing scratched but still functional. Bobby's face paled as Clara pressed a button on the radio, the faint crackle of static cutting through the silence of the store. She spoke into it with the same calm authority she'd used to call for reinforcements in Korea, her voice steady and clear. This is Major General Clara Jackson, she said, her eyes still locked on Bobby's. I'm at the Hazelton General Store, and I need immediate assistance. There's a deputy here abusing his power and threatening civilians with a firearm. I need county officials here now. The crowd gasped, a ripple of whispers spreading through the store as Clara's words sank in. Mrs. Harper clutched her chest, her eyes wide with shock, while Mr. Dawson nodded slowly, a glimmer of respect in his weathered gaze. Jenny and her friend exchanged stunned looks, their hands trembling as they clutched their Polaroids. Miss Betty, still gripping the counter, let out a shaky breath, her face a mixture of fear and admiration. Bobby's gun wavered in his hand, his confidence shattering like the glass bottle he'd dropped earlier. You can't do that, he roared, taking another step toward Clara, his voice a mix of panic and fury. I'm the law here. You don't get to call the shots. Clara lowered the radio, slipping it back into her pocket, her expression as calm as ever. I'm not calling the shots, Deputy, she said, her voice sharp and unyielding. I'm calling for justice, something you should have been doing all along. The faint wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every second, signaling that help was on the way. Bobby's eyes darted toward the door, his face a mask of dread as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. Clara pointed at him, her voice steady and commanding. This is the man they need to deal with, she said, her words ringing through the store. His actions have been witnessed by everyone here, and I've got it all written down. Bobby's gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor as the reality of what he'd done crashed down on him. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the sirens growing louder as Clara stood tall, ready to see this through to the end. Chapter 5. Justice arrives. The Hazelton General Store was frozen in a tense silence, the distant wail of sirens growing louder as they cut through the humid Georgia air. Major General Clara Jackson stood in the dry goods aisle, her yellow sundress a beacon of calm amidst the chaos, her hazel eyes steady as she faced Deputy Bobby Hayes. Bobby's revolver lay on the pine floor where he'd dropped it, his hands trembling as the reality of his actions sank in. The crowd, Mrs. Harper, Mr. Dawson, Jenny and the others, watched with bated breath, their Polaroids and whispered murmurs capturing every moment of the standoff. Clara's words still echoed in the air. This is the man they need to deal with. His actions have been witnessed by everyone here, and I've got it all written down. The screen door of the store burst open with a loud bang, and Sheriff William Bill Thornton strode in, his heavy boots thumping against the wooden floor. Bill was a tall, grizzled man in his early 60s, with a salt and pepper mustache and a weathered face that spoke of years spent keeping Hazelton in line. His sheriff's hat sat low on his brow, and his sharp green eyes took in the scene with the precision of a hawk. Bobby's gun on the floor, the spilled sarsaparilla and scattered beans, the crowd clutching their cameras, and Clara standing tall, her wicker basket still resting against her hip. Behind Bill were two county deputies, their hands resting on their holsters, ready for whatever came next. What in God's name is going on here? Bill demanded, his voice booming through the store like a clap of thunder. His gaze swept from Bobby to Clara, his expression a mix of confusion and fury. Bobby scrambled to his feet, his hands raised in a feeble attempt to explain, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Sheriff, this is all a big misunderstanding," he stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She was causing trouble, mouthing off to me, and I was just trying to keep the peace." Bill's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he turned to Clara, his tone softening with a hint of recognition. "Major General Jackson," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I got your call on the radio. Are you all right?" Clara nodded, her posture as steady as ever, though a flicker of relief passed through her eyes. "I'm fine, Sheriff," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about me. This deputy dropped some items and refused to clean them up when I asked him to. I reminded him of his responsibility to this town, and he responded with insults. Called me names, said I didn't know my place because of my race. Then he pulled his gun on me, threatened me in front of all these folks. He abused his power, and he needs to be held accountable, not just for me, but for everyone in Hazelton who's ever been treated this way." Bill's gaze shifted back to Bobby, his expression darkening with every word Clara spoke. "That true, Hayes?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of tone that made even the bravest men squirm. Bobby opened his mouth to protest, but before he could get a word out, Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her polka dot dress trembling slightly as she held up her Polaroid camera. "I got pictures, Sheriff," she said, her voice quivering but resolute. "He called her awful things, said she didn't belong here, told her to know her place. We all heard it." Mr. Dawson shuffled forward next, clutching a small notebook where he'd scribbled down what he'd seen. "He pulled that gun on her for no good reason," he said, his weathered voice firm. "Threatened her right in front of us. Ain't right, Sheriff. Not one bit." Jenny, still clutching her friend's arm, held up her own Polaroid, her voice barely above a whisper. "I took pictures too. He was yelling at her, saying he was the law and she was nothing. We all saw it." Miss Betty, still behind the counter, nodded vigorously, her flour-dusted hands gripping the edge of the counter. "It's all true, Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He disrespected her something awful, and then he pointed that gun at her like she was some kind of criminal. She didn't do nothing wrong, just asked him to clean up his mess." Bill's jaw clenched as he took the Polaroids and the notebook, his eyes scanning the evidence with a grim intensity. He turned to the crowd, his voice sharp. "Anyone else got something to say?" One by one, the customers stepped forward, offering more photos, written statements, and their own accounts of Bobby's behavior. The weight of their testimony pressed down on the deputy like a ton of bricks, his earlier arrogance replaced by a dawning fear. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. Bill turned back to Bobby, his green eyes cold as steel. "You've disgraced this badge, Hayes," he said, his voice low and furious. "You insulted a war hero, a woman who served this country with more honor than you'll ever understand. You threatened her, abused your power, and lost the trust of this town. You don't deserve to wear this uniform." He nodded to the county deputies, his voice sharp and commanding. "Take his badge and his weapon. He's done." The deputies moved swiftly, one of them picking up Bobby's revolver from the floor, while the other stepped forward to unpin the silver badge from Bobby's chest. Bobby didn't resist, his head hanging low, his hands trembling as the deputies cuffed him and led him toward the door. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of cheers and claps echoing through the store as Bobby was escorted out into the late summer sun, his career and reputation in tatters. Bill turned to Clara, his expression softening as he removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Major General Jackson, I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, his voice sincere. "This town owes you a debt of gratitude for standing up today. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Clara nodded, her eyes shining with a quiet resolve. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady. "I just hope this brings real change. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly in Hazelton." Bill tipped his head, a gesture of deep respect. "It will," he said firmly. "I'll see to it myself." The crowd continued to clap as Clara set her basket on the counter, her hands steady despite the ordeal she'd just endured. She'd come to the Hazelton General Store for a quiet afternoon, but she'd ended up fighting a battle for justice, and winning. The late summer sun dipped low over Hazelton, casting long shadows across the Ocmulgee River as Major General Clara Jackson stepped out of the Hazelton General Store, the screen door creaking softly behind her. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and river mud, a faint breeze carrying the distant hum of cicadas. Clara paused on the store's porch, her wicker basket tucked under her arm, and took a deep breath, letting the tension of the past hour melt away. The crowd inside had continued to clap as she paid for her groceries, flour, molasses, and collard greens, but she hadn't lingered to soak in their praise. She wasn't here for applause. She'd done what she had to do, just as she'd always done in her years of service. As Clara walked down the dirt path toward her small cottage on the edge of town, a few townsfolk followed her out, their voices soft with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Clara," Mrs. Harper called, clutching her polka-dot dress, her eyes still wide with awe. Mr. Dawson tipped his straw hat, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You showed 'em what's right," he said simply. Jenny and her friend waved shyly, clutching their Polaroids like precious trophies. Clara nodded to them all, her expression calm but warm, before continuing on her way. The weight of the day settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet reminder of the battles she'd fought, both on the battlefield and here in Hazelton. Meanwhile, at the county jail a few blocks away, Deputy Bobby Hayes sat in a holding cell, his head in his hands, his uniform stripped of its badge and insignia. The investigation had been swift and merciless. Sheriff Bill Thornton had overseen the process himself, gathering the Polaroids, written statements, and testimonies from the witnesses at the store. The evidence was overwhelming. Bobby's racist insults, his threats with a firearm, his blatant abuse of power, all laid bare for the county to see. By late afternoon, Bobby had been officially suspended from duty, with charges of misconduct and unlawful use of a weapon pending against him. Word of the incident spread like wildfire through Hazelton, the story racing from porch to porch, from the barber shop to the church steps. By evening, the local radio station had picked it up, the announcer's voice crackling through transistor radios across town. "A Hazelton deputy has been stripped of his badge after threatening a decorated war hero in the general store today." The news sparked outrage, and soon others came forward with their own stories of Bobby's prejudice. Farmers he'd harassed, black townsfolk he'd targeted with unfair fines, women he'd belittled in the street. Bobby's career was over, his reputation shattered, and as he sat in that cell, the weight of his mistakes pressed down on him like a millstone. He'd always thought his badge made him untouchable, but now he was nothing, just a man facing the consequences of his own arrogance. Clara, meanwhile, reached her cottage just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of peach and lavender. The small house was a modest affair, with a wraparound porch and a garden bursting with tomatoes and okra. She set her basket on the kitchen counter, the collard greens still damp with morning dew, and began preparing her supper. As she chopped the greens and set a pot of water to boil, her mind wandered back to the events at the store. She thought of Bobby's sneering face, the cold metal of his gun, the fear in the eyes of the crowd. But she also thought of the way they'd rallied around her, the way their voices had joined hers in the fight for justice. It reminded her of her army days, when her soldiers had stood by her side through the toughest battles. Later that evening, as Clara sat at her kitchen table with a plate of collard greens and cornbread, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Miss Betty, the store owner, holding a small stack of letters and a copy of the Hazelton Gazette. "Folks been dropping these off at the store for you," Betty said, her voice warm, "and the paper just came out. Thought you'd want to see it." Clara took the items with a quiet thank you, and Betty left with a smile, her flour-dusted apron fluttering in the evening breeze. Clara sat back down, unfolding the newspaper. The headline blared across the front page: "War Hero Stands Up to Corrupt Deputy, Sparks Justice in Hazelton." The article detailed the incident at the store, praising Clara's courage and condemning Bobby's actions. The letters were from townsfolk. Some she knew, some she didn't, each one filled with gratitude and admiration. "You're a blessing to this town," one read. "Thank you for showing us what justice looks like," said another. Clara read each one slowly, her heart swelling with a quiet pride, not for the recognition, but for the change she'd helped bring about. As she finished her meal and set the letters aside, Clara looked out her kitchen window at the moonlit river in the distance. She'd come to Hazelton for peace, but today she'd found a new purpose. She'd fought for justice just as she always had, and though the battle had been hard, it had been worth it. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 7, A Lasting Legacy. The days following the incident at the Hazelton General Store stretched into weeks, and the ripples of Major General Clara Jackson's stand spread far beyond the small riverside town of Hazelton, Georgia. The late summer heat gave way to the crisp air of early fall, the pecan orchards glowing golden under the September sun, and the Ocmulgee River shimmering like a ribbon of glass. But beneath the quiet beauty of the season, Hazelton was changing, slowly, steadily, in ways that Clara had never imagined when she'd walked into the store that fateful afternoon. Sheriff Bill Thornton didn't waste any time after the confrontation. Within days of Bobby Hayes' suspension, Bill rolled out new training programs for his deputies, focusing on ethics, accountability, and respect for every citizen, regardless of race or gender. He brought in speakers from Atlanta, civil rights advocates and former military officers, who lectured the deputies on the true meaning of service. Bill himself sat in on every session, his weathered face set with determination, making it clear that what happened with Bobby would never happen again on his watch. "We're here to protect this town, not tear it apart," he told his team, his voice firm. "And if any of you forget that, you'll answer to me." The county didn't stop there. A week after the incident, the Hazelton Town Hall hosted a community meeting, and Clara was invited to speak. She stood at the podium in the crowded hall, her straw hat resting on the table beside her, her yellow sundress replaced with a simple navy skirt and blouse. The room was packed. Farmers in overalls, school teachers in their Sunday best, kids clutching their parents' hands, all there to hear the woman who'd stood up to injustice. Clara didn't speak for applause. She spoke to remind them of what she'd learned in her years of service. "Power is only meaningful when it's used to protect, not to oppress," she said, her voice steady and clear, echoing through the hall. "I didn't stand up that day for myself. I stood up for all of us, for the kind of town we deserve to live in." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing long after Clara stepped down, her words planting seeds of change in their hearts. For Bobby Hayes, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. His trial came a month later, held in the county courthouse under the watchful eyes of Hazelton's residents. The evidence was damning. The Polaroids, the witness statements, Clara's own meticulous notes, all painting a clear picture of his abuse of power. Bobby stood in the courtroom, his head bowed, his once proud posture reduced to a slump of defeat. The judge sentenced him to 6 months of community service and a permanent ban from law enforcement, his career officially over. The town turned its back on him. Former friends stopped calling, colleagues shook their heads in disgust, and the Hazelton Gazette ran a scathing editorial. "A deputy's downfall, the cost of arrogance." Bobby moved away shortly after. A broken man, his life a stark lesson in the consequences of injustice. Clara, meanwhile, returned to her quiet life, tending her garden and baking cornbread for the church potlucks. She didn't seek the spotlight, but Hazelton wouldn't let her story fade. Her actions became a legend whispered on porches and shared over diner counters, a symbol of what it meant to stand up for what's right. Young girls in town looked up to her, their eyes bright with admiration as they passed her cottage, whispering, "That's the lady who fought the deputy." Clara would smile and wave, her heart warmed by their awe, knowing she'd given them a glimpse of what courage could look like. The changes in Hazelton didn't stop with the sheriff's office. Clara's story sparked a broader movement in the community. The town council established a committee to address racial tensions, holding regular meetings where Black and white residents could voice their concerns. Local schools began teaching lessons on equality and justice, using Clara's stand as a teaching moment. And when the Hazelton Gazette published a follow-up story, A Veteran's Legacy, How One Woman Changed Hazelton, it was picked up by newspapers in Atlanta, inspiring activists across Georgia to push for similar reforms in their own towns. One crisp October evening, Clara sat on her porch, a glass of sweet tea in her hand, watching the sun set over the river. The sky was a blaze of orange and pink, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. She thought back to that day in the general store, the spilled sarsaparilla, Bobby's sneering face, the cold barrel of his gun. She thought of the crowd, the way they'd rallied around her, and the changes that had followed. Clara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a soldier who'd done her duty, just as she always had. But as she sipped her tea, a quiet pride settled over her, not for the recognition, but for the difference she'd made. Hazelton was a better place because of her, and that was enough. Clara's legacy would live on, not just in the reform she'd inspired or the stories told about her, but in the hearts of every person who'd heard her story and found the courage to stand up for justice. As the last light of day faded over the Okmulgee River, Clara smiled softly to herself, knowing she'd fought the good fight and won.